Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Week 13 Inside Injuries podcast. I'm your host, Tim McCullough, and with me, as always, from Inside Injuries is Virginia Zakis. Virginia, how are you this afternoon?
Doing very well. Getting excited for fantasy playoffs that are coming up. Lots of players to talk about.
Yes, there are a lot of players, and of course, fantasy teams are looking to qualify the playoffs. This is their last chance in most cases, as the fantasy playoffs begin in earnest in probably 90% of leagues with Week 14. So this is a very important week. I just want to remind our listeners that you should always check in at Inside Injuries before you set your lineups to get the very latest on the injured players around the NFL. And in the NBA and in other leagues throughout the year. And you can always send us your questions on Twitter at Inside Injuries, and you can also send them to me at Tim's Tens. That's at TIMSTENZ. And Virginia, please give them your Twitter handle as well.
At VZakas, ZAKAS.
Excellent. All right, Virginia, let's get started with A.J. Green. We've had a lot of questions about him. It didn't look like he was going to play. Now there's talk that he is going to play. In fact, the quote directly from A.J. Green himself that he's going to play. But the truth of the matter is he ready to return?
So I finally have some good news on A.J. Green. When he originally hurt his toe, we gave him a 5-week optimal recovery time, which means we thought he should medically be able to return in week 13. And it sounds like he's on track to do just that. He returned to practice yesterday. He says he's going to suit up this weekend. And his health performance factor, which is our metric to predict how well a player is going to perform, is back in that above average category, which is pretty good. For a guy like Green, who obviously has such high upside, he's an elite receiver. That means we actually think he's going to play pretty well as long as he stays on the field. Now, the one thing to watch is his overall injury risk is still in that high category. Big toe injuries are really tough to fully recover from. So again, we think he's made enough progress to play and play pretty well, but every single lower body movement a wide receiver makes affects that big toe, whether it's pushing off, jumping, accelerating, everything goes back to the big toe. So, there is a chance that one wrong movement and he could aggravate it, but he should be good to go.
All right, and of course, our listeners really want to know, and we've had a lot of questions about whether or not we should actually start him this week in fantasy play. And there's some question about what happens to some of the other receivers on the Bengals if he does play. And as far as that's concerned, I think, I think he can definitely play A.J. Green as a WR2 this week. I'm not real thrilled with Jeff Driscoll as the quarterback. But if that's what you've got to deal with, then I think you can't possibly sit Green. What it does to the other receivers, though, is it does bump down their value at least a little bit, although not a ton. Tyler Boyd and John Ross have become a couple of very favorite targets in that offense, and I don't see that stopping now. Driscoll had a good connection with them when they were playing last week. Once he came into the game. So I don't think there's a lot of change to the fantasy value of those players. Obviously, Green is a WR2. I can't put him in the WR1 category just because Driscoll's inexperience. So that's kind of the story with A.J. Green. I would go ahead and start him. Just sort of temper expectations because I don't see it being a huge week for him. All right, let's talk about Tre'Quan Smith. We've had a lot of questions about him as well, and whether or not he can be effective tonight with his injury. What's the story with Smith?
So Smith was removed from the injury report, and he is going to play tonight after missing last week with that foot injury. So his numbers have improved. He's no longer a high injury risk. He's now elevated. So that's progress, but still not great. And his health performance factor is still in that below average category. Foot injuries are just tough to play through. I don't think he's 100% yet, given his practice statuses this week. I think he'll show significant improvement by next week after having 10 days off. But he's just a week and a half removed from this injury. So I don't think he's quite ready to return yet and play at his best tonight. So I would consider him kind of a high risk, high reward play. Of course, in this offense, he's going to have plenty of opportunities if he can stay on the field, but he's just not 100%. His speed could be affected. His routes might not be quite as crisp if his foot's bothering him a little bit.
Yeah, and as far as his fantasy value tonight, and really looking forward to the rest of the season, let's talk first about tonight. I don't think you could play Smith tonight. I want to see him on the field. I want to see that he's healthy. I want to know that I can use him. He's not the primary receiver on that team, and therefore, I don't have great expectations for him. And it's not a terrific matchup. That's the other problem here. The Cowboys can be really tough. In fact, they're one of the toughest uh, defenses against the wide receiver position. They've allowed only an average of 29.6 fantasy points to the wide receiver position this season on a per game basis. They've allowed only 8 touchdowns to wide receivers this season, which is among the lowest in the NFL. So I'm not, and this is a defense that's been improving as the season has gone on. So regardless of the fact that the Saints are a highly prolific offense, I'm not real favorable when it comes to Smith for tonight. Now, looking ahead to the rest of the season, it's sort of a different story. Next week's matchup is with the Buccaneers, one of the most it's one of the softest pass defenses in the league. They allow the most yardage to wide receivers, to the wide receiver position. They allow a ton of touchdowns to wide receivers. I love the matchup next week. The following week is against the Panthers, and in Week 16 they would face the Steelers. And while those are definitely not tough defenses, they're not easy defenses either. If Smith proves healthy and is able to play well this week and next week, I don't see any reason why you couldn't start him during those weeks as well. I certainly like the other Saints receivers much more than Smith over the next 3 weeks. But Smith will have some value later in the season, and so he's worth hanging on to see if he is indeed healthy. All right, moving along. Virginia, let's talk a little bit about one of my least favorite players this season, Sammy Watkins. How serious is this foot injury, and what's going on with him?
I'll start by saying he never should have played that Monday night game. Of course, he only played in that first series. I'm guessing he re-aggravated his foot, even though they didn't say it. Either way, his injury risk is now very high. His health performance factor is below average. We just talked about how tough foot injuries are to overcome. You could tell even watching clips of him warming up before that Monday night game that he wasn't really pushing off of that foot. So he was nowhere near being healthy. He hasn't practiced yet this week. As of Thursday, he had another DNP. I think he's looking very doubtful for week 13. I don't think there's any guarantee at this point that he'll be ready to go week 14. And this could be something that continues to linger for the rest of the season.
Yeah, I think I made it pretty clear in an earlier podcast that I am not a Watkins fan this season. He's been pretty much a glorified decoy, with the exception of one game, that, in which he scored 22.7 fantasy points. For the rest of the season, he hasn't been above 13 fantasy points in any game, and his average in the rest of them is somewhere around 4 fantasy points per game. I mean, you just can't trust him. You can't trust him this week and going forward. The Kansas City Chiefs schedule, while soft in Week 13, gets tough starting with next week when they face the Ravens. Then they face the Chargers and the Seahawks. These are some tough defenses against the pass. The Seahawks have especially improved in recent weeks. And I can't imagine using Watkins at all for the rest of the season. As far as the rest of the receivers go, Tyreek Hill is a week-to-week must play. You can't sit the guy. And the same is starting to become true of Chris Conley as far as maybe a flex play goes if you have him. Although during some of these tougher match weeks that are coming up, I think I may temper that as well. He's never more than a flex play, really. Really, the only must start among the Kansas City receivers is Hill. Uh, so don't trust Watkins. Always trust Hill, and sometimes you can trust Conley. It's really a week to week matchup based kind of thing. All right, moving along. Kerryon Johnson. It looks like he's going to miss this week again. How much longer do you expect him to be out, Virginia?
So we're picking up a grade 2 knee sprain, which means it's a moderate sprain. There could be some damage to the ligaments, but not serious enough that it requires surgery. Given that it's a 4-week optimal recovery time, so we don't think he should return before week 15. A lot of the time when running backs have this type of injury, they try to return in around 3 weeks, which would put a return around week 14. So I wouldn't be surprised if he tries to practice next week, but I don't think it's too likely that he will play. And if he does, I believe he will underperform. He's sitting at a below average health performance factor right now, which tells me that his knee injury really would affect him if he takes the field. He's yet to practice this week, so very, very unlikely to suit up week 13. But if he wants to be healthy to finish the season, he should wait 2 more weeks.
All right. And thinking about the games this week and whether or not you should be using any of the Lions running backs, really the only guy you can use this week, I think, is LeGarrette Blount. He was a big surprise for me last week. I think I recommended to sit him, and he went out there and racked up 88 yards and a pair of touchdowns, along with one reception for 15 yards, which is always a big surprise from Blount. He's not known to be a pass catcher. In fact, I think you could probably count the passes he's catched in his career on one hand. Uh, anyway, he racked up 22.3 fantasy points last week. And the truth of the matter is, he's got a chance to do it again this week. The Chargers' rush defense is not nearly as tough as Chicago's. Chicago's got the number 2 ranked rush defense in the NFL, and he was able to gash them for 88 yards. The Chargers are somewhere around 13, allowing 107.5 yards per week, and just 6 touchdowns this season. But prior to last week, Chicago had only allowed 2 rushing touchdowns. So I think you can definitely start Blount this week. I wouldn't put him out there instead of a stud, but if you need a good flex who could have some decent upside this week, I would certainly go with Blount. All right, Melvin Gordon. We have a lot of questions about Melvin Gordon and when he's going to come back. What is the story with Gordon's injury?
So Gordon is dealing with a grade 2 MCL sprain. We're showing a 5-week optimal recovery time for this, so pretty serious. I don't see him being fully healthy before the end of the season. Now, I do think he could play in the next, I'll say 2 to 3 weeks, but he's not going to be 100%. Of course, he's a guy that when he's on the field, if he's getting enough carries, he's going to have some value, but his risk of re-injury will be pretty high. He's a high injury risk right now, of course, and it looks like it's going to stay that way for at least the next few weeks. So I don't trust him through at least week 15, and even in week 16 and 17, I think he's going to be a very, very risky fantasy option. And at this point, I don't think it's any guarantee that he'll return by week 15 or 16.
All right. And, as far as who steps up in his place, clearly it's going to be Austin Ekeler. There's almost no chance that nobody else will step up in his place. Eckler's going to be the starter. He not only is a decent rusher, averaging more than 5 yards per carry this season, he's also an excellent pass catcher. He's got 44 receptions already this year with 453 yards. But another guy to keep an eye on is Justin Jackson. Now, I don't think I'd play him this week. He's not seen a ton of action this year. He's only played 3 games. But last week, he had 7 rushing attempts for 57 yards. That's an 8.1 yard per carry average. And he is also an excellent pass catcher out of the backfield. So I think you should keep an eye on Jackson. If you have Ekeler on your roster, you should probably have Jackson as a handcuff at this point because Gordon is not going to be back, as Virginia said, until later in the season. And of course, with the fantasy playoffs coming up, Eckler is going to be an every week play. If he goes down with an injury, Jackson's going to be the guy. And in that offense, as prolific as that offense has been, I don't think I'd be without either of those running backs if you've been counting on a Chargers running back this season. Well, that about wraps it up for us, Virginia. Let's remind our listeners one more time. Don't forget to check at insideinjuries.com before you set your lineups. Check my rankings, which will be updated right up to 12:30 on Sunday, and check our other information about injuries and get your inside edge on injuries around the NFL and also in the NBA and in other leagues around the year. If you have questions, please make sure you send them to us at Inside Injuries. And you can also send them to me at Tim's10s, TIMSTENZ. And Virginia, one more time, give them your Twitter handle.
At VZakas, ZAKAS.
All right. I wish all of you good luck in week 13, and hopefully you'll be back for the playoffs in week 14 through 16. And we'll certainly be back next week. Thanks again. Bye-bye.